For those who are very interested in the ancient connection, we digress slightly and brought things up to the modern era, but perhaps it's also important to re-stress exactly how these oligarchs follow through in a bloodline manner. And one of the most important connections from the ancient world, the ancient dynasties, up into the modern, are a group of people from Italy, from Venice specifically, that have dominated the world for many generations, that have been loosely called the Black Venetians. Now this term, the Black Venetians or the Black Nobility, is their own term. This is not just a historical term used for them. This is one of their own terms. And they became known as the Black Nobility or the Black Venetians because literally their deeds were so black. Now the word Phoenician, who were the ancient descendants of the Atlantean race, an old ancient Semitic race. The Phoenicians were like the elites of the Semites. Okay, we have the Semitic race. The Semitic race is the largest racial group in the world. Well, we have many branches of the Semitic peoples. And the elites, you could say the royalty within the Semitic race, were what we know as the Phoenician race. These are the people who built the Temple of Solomon, who were the great navigators, the great mappers of the sky, and the great mathematicians and so on. Well, down into the modern world as we progress through the ages, the word Phoenician, as the Phoenicians settled in Italy, they became known as the Venetians, the Venetians. And they're worshippers of Venus. One of their gods or goddesses was literally Venetian. They're Venus worshippers. And that figures because if you're on the high seas, the stars and the moon and the luminaries are very important to you. And the Venetians, we have many families making up the Venetian oligarchy, but the Longhi and the Guelphs are of particular interest. Now, upon their move to Holland, the Black Venetians created the Great Amsterdam Bank, the financial hinge of the 17th century, and they also created the Dutch East India Company. They also controlled the finances of many royal dynasties, like the Stuarts. So they were lenders, financiers of some of the royal families. They are also the promoters of Martin Luther, of Protestantism, Puritanism, the Jesuits, the Club of Rome, the later Freemasons, and most other secret societies. Through the House of Hanover, that's the House of Orange, they came to England and have been the dominating power since William III. Christina Huth, in her book Venice, The Methodology of Evil, Part 3, she writes, Henry VIII had also thrown open the door for the cultural, political, and financial takeover of England by agents of the city-state of Venice. By the middle of the 1530s, Henry's government was in the hands of the Venetian agents and being shaped into a model of police-state political terror. By the end of Henry's reign, Venetian bankers were in control of a burgeoning English foreign debt and dictating terms to the English throne. Within slightly over a century following Henry's death, England had been transformed into the usurious, slave-trading imperial power of Great Britain under the dictatorship of the Venetian party, which had been transplanted directly from the lagoons of Venice. Now obviously in one program we can't go into this subsection, the whole story of the Venetian peoples. Just for now doing an overview to show you that here we have the connection between the Stuarts, the Tudors, and these Venetians. And the takeover was implemented by Thomas Cromwell. This was the agent who convinced Henry VIII to buy in and to accept the money of the incoming Venetians. So this connection is very, very vital and important to understand how the Phoenician, Sumerian, Babylonian, Mesopotamian, Nephilim concept, that bloodline, ties into the modern oligarchs. There's a thread. It can be traced like anything. The congressman and statesman Lyndon LaRouche, from an American context, is one of the greatest experts on this. But there's many other works talking about this connection. King William III of Hanover, the Prince of Orange. And we have George Ludwig I, also of the House of Hanover. These are the two kings, specifically, of the House of Orange, coming out of Italy by way of Holland. They appear in the history books as being Dutch kings, Dutch potentates, but their ancestry goes further back than that. Graham Lowry, in How the Venetian Virus Infected and Took Over England, writes, in December 1688, the armies of the Dutch Prince William of Orange invaded England, interrupting the Hobbesian nightmare the country had experienced under the deranged King Charles II and his brother James II. A worse nightmare was to follow when William seized the throne of James II, for he embodied a more highly distilled form of poison which Venice had perfected during its sway over the remains of the Dutch Republic. This outright usurpation is blithely referred to in British Venetian parlance as the Glorious Revolution, which should give you some idea of how little regard for truth prevails in these circles. So here's a scholar who's in no doubt about the problem whatsoever. He's pointing out that the James II and Charles II debauchery is one thing, and then it's replaced by yet even more layers of the same thing. And as I said earlier, is it not from these times that all these idioms we just take for granted of the British Stock Exchange, the rising of the Navy, the great conflicts throughout the world, the whole concept of empire, the rising of the great universities, the rising of the merchant class? Who are the merchants named after Mercury? We have some questions here. The very things that we take for granted, the very idea that individuals on the street level say, oh, we can't imagine any secret society just coming in and taking over. Well, that's right. You needn't imagine that because it didn't happen. Secret societies obviously couldn't just come in to the wide diversity of our modern age and just take over. But they didn't do that. These oligarchs formed our cities. They formed the political systems that we have. No more than a few hundred years ago, it was crown or it was gown. It was cross or it was crown. It was monarch on one side to mind control you and brainwash you and throw you in a dungeon, or it was the popes and the potentates. Two forms of control. Nobody just came in and took over. These individuals have created our cities, created our industries. They were there from day one. They were billionaires from the 1st century AD. And they're dancing on their desks to find out how easy it is to manipulate the herd, of the population of the world. But they didn't just suddenly come in and take over like some normal mafioso group. These individuals created the entire structure of our life. Our forefathers, not so long ago, never even ventured more than 5-10 miles from their feudal villages. In fact, it was even a crime to even do so. So nothing could have been easier. You have military, monarchy, and you have the religious, the theocracy. Two forms that attain world domination more simply than we can ever even imagine. David Icke, in his book The Biggest Secret, says, William of Orange, that's William III, died in 1702. He and his wife Mary left no heirs, and so Mary's sister Anne became queen. Anne was the last of the Stuart monarchs. In 1714, the scene was set for the takeover of the British crown by the German black nobility family, the Hanovers. They were closely connected with the House of Hesse, which would become the launch pad for the House of Rothschild. The first Hanoverian king was George I. Queen Victoria, always famous for wearing black jewelry and wearing black clothes, was the Empress of India, the Empress of the world, the top of the Guelph dynasty. The family of Guelph, who was one of the major black nobility families. Today's modern Windsor family directly go back to the Guelph dynasty of the ancient world. The Guelph, Bourse-Lyon, Battenberg, Mountbatten, whatever you want to call it. These are all Hanoverian, Habsburgian families, all connected, all linked by blood. The British royal family, the Windsors, was a name adopted in the 1800s, and the reason was to give them an anglicized front, because in fact George I could hardly speak a word of English, and here they are declaring war on his brother the Kaiser in the First World War, and the so-called British royal family could hardly speak the English language. So in order to anglicize them and make them look more English, they adopted the name Windsor. But their original ancestral names is Saxe-Coburg-Battenberg, which they changed again to Mountbatten, Bourse-Lyon, which is the name of the Queen Mother, and Guelph. The word Guelph is the key word there because that's the Venetian connection, the Black Guelphs. Open any encyclopedia and start reading up on the black nobility and the Guelphs, and a fascinating story will unfold. Valdemar Valerian refers to them as the Serpentine world order, understanding that these people are from the Serpent dynasties. All subsequent coups d'etats and revolutions and wars of the 19th and 20th centuries are centered in the battle of the Guelphs to hold and enhance their power, now the New World Order. In Atlantis, Alien Visitation and Genetic Manipulation, my book, I point out the fact that look at the grammar. Look at the statement. If you have a new world order, does not that imply in a way that we have an old world disorder? Well, as I've pointed out in this program, there certainly was more than enough disorder in the old world. And for those who think that the American politicians and leaders are in fact Republican and American and disconnected from royal ties, we find from David Icke that the Queen of England made Bush's military chiefs Colin Powell and Norman Schwarzkopf honorary knights of the British Empire. Honorary knights of the British Empire. This is not just some minor award you just happen to get of a weekend. These pats on the back show you who these individuals are actually working for. The British system controls the American system and always has. This is a republic on paper. That's it. The Constitution has long been null and void. The country's been bankrupt and in debt for goodness knows how long. And every leader, including Roosevelt, all the way back to the Founding Fathers, has been an agent of the Black Venetians, of the Knights Templar, the Knights of Columbus, the Freemasonic organizations, the Illuminati, and the British system that controls them. Professor Anthony Sutton, who wrote this fine book on the subject, American professor, was actually approached by the Skull and Bones as they attempted to recruit him. And not knowing who on earth this group was, he researched it. He opened their packages, he looked into the whole question, and in horror of who these people were, after years of research, he wrote many books on the subject, including this, America's Secret Establishment, Introduction to the Order of the Skull and Bones. And Sutton has grasped the essence of what we're saying here. He says in his book, their interests are global, and much as they may protest, we see no difference between trilateral globalism and, for example, British and French imperialism of the 19th century, or the Holy Roman Empire, for that matter. How right he is. Webster Tarpley, in the book The Venetian Takeover of England, writes, the oligarchical system of Great Britain is not autochthonous, product of English or British history. It represents rather the tradition, which has been transplanted into the British Isles through a series of upheavals into England and Scotland from the Venetian oligarchy, along with its philosophy, political forms, family fortunes, and imperial geopolitics. Jeffrey Steinberg, in The Last Empire in the History of the World, writes, these families constitute a financier oligarchy. They are the power behind the Windsor throne. They view themselves as the heirs to the Venetian oligarchy, which infiltrated and subverted England from the period of 1509 to 1715, and established a new, more virulent Anglo-Dutch-Swiss strain of the oligarchical system of Imperial Babylon, Persia, Rome, and Byzantine. So there you have it. There is a direct paragraph that shows you the connection. Incidentally, Switzerland, as we mentioned earlier, is where the headquarters of World Freemasonry is. And over the door in Zurich, Switzerland, you can go there yourself. And that's where the courts are. That's where the so-called charities of the world, like the Red Cross, are located, and many others. It's also where the world banks are kept. Those secretive world banks. Well, of course they're secretive. The oligarchs don't want you tracking the checks, following the money. But you also have the headquarters of World Freemasonry. And over the door, plain as day for everyone to see, it says in Latin, Ordo ab chaos, order out of chaos. Implemented by the likes of Albert Pike and many of the politicians of the world. You create wall-to-wall evil, wall-to-wall debauchery, wall-to-wall license, and wall-to-wall chaos. You fund the gangs, you fund the terrorists of the world. You create so much upheaval that the masses, who are your real enemy, your real rivals, just come to you in a big line saying, help us, what can we do? Let's strengthen the powers of government. If it worked for Adolf Hitler and Genghis Khan, it works for anybody. The statesman and leading economist, Lyndon LaRouche, who himself has spent time in the federal stockade, has this to say, the Venetian method is the method of not taking sides, but playing sides against one another to one's advantage. You go into a country, you go among a people, you go to an individual person and you corrupt them by knowing the principle of corruption, which is embedded in every person. That principle of corruption is the person's self-ego. as an autonomous ego, as a microcosm in counterposition, in struggle against the macrocosm. What LaRouche is pointing out here is more metaphysical. He's saying that the individual falls under hypnosis, he falls under control because he himself is divided. This is a more sinister, the more subtle, the more pernicious form of control. It's not just political, it's not just social, it's not just domestic. There's a psychological component to this. And I'll go into this in other programs in the series. But this idea of being in conflict within is the perfect bedrock, the perfect state of affairs that needs to exist before you accept or you become blinded to the conflict around you. You're more susceptible to that kind of control if your body politic, your own republic, is in complete chaos. James Morris, in his book Pax Britannica, says, before she set out on her Diamond Jubilee procession, on the morning of 22nd of June 1897, Queen Victoria of England went to the telegraph room at Buckingham Palace. It was a few minutes after 11 o'clock. She pressed an electric button. An impulse was transmitted to the Central Telegraph Office in St. Martin-le-Grand. In a matter of seconds, her Jubilee message was on its way to every corner of her empire. It was the largest empire in the history of the world, comprising nearly a quarter of the land mass of the earth and a quarter of its population. Victoria herself was Queen Empress of such aged majesty that some of her simpler subjects considered her divine and slaughtered propitiatory goats before her image. So what Morris is bringing out here is the size and magnitude of this empire. And of course, we might ask a very simple question. What do you need empire for? Why would such a small, minuscule, insignificant country like England, of all places, granted with its Venetian Dutch oligarchy in control, why would it suddenly rise to send its tentacles out to the world? What is the reason? That reason has never been really handed to us. It's always put down to power and money, and that just covers it. But now we know of the old Atlantean tie, the old John Dee pact, and the idea that all peoples, all nations, all tribes had to be subjugated. The diamond mines, the ores that were needed to artificially move technology forward, move mankind forward to the point where the technology of the Nephilim could be rebuilt. We still live in those times. It's happening right before our eyes. Now, you have to take what popes say with a pinch of salt, but what Pope Pius VI said in his book, Memoirs of a Renaissance Pope, bears reading about the Venetians. He makes an interesting comment. He says, but what do fish care about law? As among brute beasts, aquatic creatures have the least intelligence. So, among human beings, the Venetians are the least just and least capable of humanity. And naturally, for they live on sea and pass their lives in the water. They use ships instead of horses. They are not so much companions of men as of fish and comrades of marine monsters. They wish to appear Christians before the world, but in reality they never think of God, and except for the state, which they do regard as a deity, they hold nothing sacred. Jeffrey Steinberg also says, among their own ranks, these financier oligarchs refer them to themselves as the Club of the Isles, after the original Prince of the Isles, Edward Albert, that's King Edward VII, the son of Queen Victoria, who orchestrated the Crimean War, the Opium Wars, the Russo-Japanese War, and World War I, to consolidate Britain as the primus inter pares, that's the first among equals, of the European monarchs and feudal families. The Club of the Isles, under the direction of the British monarchy, draws its resources and personalities from the Netherlands, Switzerland, France, Germany, and Italy, and orchestrates the actions of the caste of terminally Anglophilic Americans, typified by Henry Kissinger and former President George Bush. Now, in conclusion, in the last chapter of my book, Atlantis, I talk about the fact that here we are at a state where the Nephilim agenda, the Atlantean agenda of getting the technology back and also trying to solve this problem of the Stargate are coming into their latter days. The solution, the final solution is at hand. And in the book I mentioned that there are 4 possible outcomes, 4 possible conclusion scenarios. You know, there's a reason why the oligarchs love pyramids. And if you stand in front of a pyramid, you'll notice that it's a triangle in front of you. But of course, a pyramid is made of 4 phases, 4 triangles. The swastika is a 4-fold device. The Knights of Malta cross, which is nothing but a pyramid seen from above, by the way. But the Knights of Malta cross is also 4-fold. There seems to be a penchant in secret societies for 4-fold symbolism, and perhaps there's a reason. So taking that motif, taking that paradigm, I thought that there were 4 outcome scenarios that might be played out in the next generation, or even less, next decade or so. Briefly speaking, I call these 4 outcomes: number 1, the burn and rise no more outcome. Number 2 is the bridges to Babylon outcome. Number 3 in the book, it says start the fuse tactor. And number 4 is the Empire Strikes Back scenario. More specifically, outcome 1, the progeny of Atlantis succeed in regaining all their technological hardware, especially that for breaking through the Stargate, and prepare for departure. In so doing, they come out into the open more than ever, startling the human race, who cannot comprehend what is happening. When they are out of range, they destroy our planet and all that lives on it. Does that seem far-fetched? Well, let's think. Does any criminal like to leave footprints and fingerprints behind? The individuals who came here and got interned on our planet have absolutely no love for us. And even though we're talking about the descendants of the Atlanteans, they have enough alien blood as their treatment of the planet, their treatment of womankind, their treatment of children, their treatment of animals should show you exactly who these people are and what they believe. So criminals do not like to leave traces behind if they can prevent it. So let's just bear that in mind. Outcome 2, the bridges to Babylon. The masters realize that no matter what they do, they cannot vacate the earth, and that they are forever chained to the pit. In this case, they rule the world with unmitigated tyranny, relentlessly and openly. The human race loses whatever privileges, quote unquote, it enjoyed while its utility was beneficial. Now it is deprived and slaughtered. Debauchery is everywhere, and people even turn upon themselves, sinking into chaos of unimaginable proportions, with all the dark, repressed content of consciousness in full view, without the restraint of inner or outer authority. We see many movies, from Judge Dredd to Blade Runner to all sorts of movies showing the debauchery, the coming chaos in the streets, from They Live to Life Force. Lots of movies contemplating this particular type of scenario where law and order goes out the door, and all that is repressed within us, all the years of frustration and hatred, that's encoded in us, the human race just goes crazy with cudgels in the street type of scenario. Number 3, the good, quote unquote, under the weight of the yoke, finally rise against their oppressors, actively preventing them from ever leaving and taking their evil elsewhere. However, to do this, we destroy, that is, sacrifice ourselves, taking them with us. And I'm thinking of Start the Fuse Tector from the Sam Peckinpah movie, the Wild Bunch. I mean, this is kind of heroics that probably would very much impress Sam Peckinpah. Naturally, it's something we would not normally want to choose, because it would mean that the earth would just become a revolving headstone. You solve your problem, though, but it's not the best option. However, this kind of scenario almost has taken place several times in history before. In Celtic mythology, if you read in detail the stories of the Taffety Danann and how they had to combat these forces with sword in hand, by the way. They weren't doing it today with microphones, cameras, placards and speeches and books. They actually did it on the field of battle right in front of these individuals. The movie Highlander comes to mind, which in a fictional way shows this particular kind of conflict taking place between the giants and the heroes. Now, the fourth outcome, or scenario, which I entitled The Empire Strikes Back, we find that mankind finally discovers the correct means to the end and vanquishes its enemy with no excessive loss of life or homeworld. We eradicate the enemy and finally resolve the problem of evil. The beasts are slain, the damsels rescued, and the ending happy. Now, up until now, even with the vast majority of their sophisticated technical hardware again in their possession, the progeny of the Atlanteans are not able to break out of their quarantine, out of their internment on the silent planet. In the book Against Civilization, we read, the combined military expenditures of all the world's governments in 1987 were so large that all of the social programs of the United Nations could be financed for 300 years. This one caption, this one statement, basically tells us the whole gig. In 1 year, just 1987, we have this vast expenditure on what? Technology and military. But yet every program of the United Nations, they're all screaming for money and let's heal the world. We can't get round to it. We just don't know how we can crack it. I don't know how backward you have to be to not see what the problem is, what the agenda is. $900+ billion is spent on military budgets a year worldwide, with 50% of that spent by the US. The Pentagon spent $9,000 per second before the 9/11 attack. The percentage of US military spending that would ensure the essentials of life to everyone in the world, according to the United Nations, is a mere 10% of that. That's about $40 billion, which was in fact the amount of funding initially requested to fund our retaliatory attack on Afghanistan. Now, coming to the whole question, the ongoing pursuit of getting out of here, you may build your technology back to the place where you had it 50,000 years ago when you crossed space. You may have those UFOs, and those UFOs are being sighted from Mexico, all over the world, from Australia. Individuals in our modern world are seeing constant evidence. There's plenty of traffic in the sky to prove that there's UFO activity, even though we're being duped into thinking it's true extraterrestrials visiting our planet. We're not aware yet, as I advocate, that these are Earth ships. These are the product not only of Hermann Oberth and Werner von Braun from Germany, but from the Renaissance, from the time of Leonardo da Vinci. And before, we have crafts, I believe, that were able to be rebuilt and flew up into the heavens, discovered the existence of the Stargate. So here we have this problem. Now, in the book, what we talk about is how you will go about then breaking through this. Dee and his macrobes have offered up the world in a ritual. Two of the basic tenets that were handed down was, look, you have to learn how to release energy from matter, but we're going to have to show you that in 2 stages because you're too dumb to get it. They told this to Dee. They said, you humans are not going to get this, so we'll have hundreds of years just to show you the first, how you release energy from matter, which was, in history, the releasing of the atomic bomb. Then they pat themselves on the back saying, we've got that far. So from that age, from the time of the atom bomb's explosion, the next phase of the macrobes takes place. How now to show how to create matter from energy. This is the high technology that's needed to deal with the Stargate. So SRI, MIT, many of the think tanks and technical agencies that are out there, all the experimentation and research into nanotechnology and virtual reality and all the other expenditures while people are starving in the world. There's an agenda, an occult agenda. And the occult agenda is seen on the logos of half of these corporations. They're not even trying to hide it from us. But they know, as Edgar Allan Poe said, you want to hide something, you put it in plain sight. But there's been other attempts to break through the Stargate. And there have actually been explosions, detonations, huge nuclear and atomic explosions let off in our ionosphere by the governments of the world. Residents in Faulkner and Garland counties believe they saw meteors soaring through the atmosphere just after 10 o'clock on Tuesday night. Experts of the Arkansas Sky Observatory explain it's the end of a major meteor shower related to Halley's Comet. Conway resident Tammy Earnhardt knows is that the sonic boom was enough to rattle her entire house. It just shook all of the doors and everything. It was just a loud boom that shook everything. It sounded like a train was coming through our house. It was that loud. And Joshua Meeks says he saw a big ball of fire, like a big flash. I mean, it was almost as big as the moon. Many in Conway and Hot Springs saw those flashes, but it's unclear where or if anything made it to the ground. If it was, in fact, a meteor, they're a rare find in Arkansas. So these explosions, these detonations are going there in an attempt to break through. There's been many different kinds of attempts to help try to break through the Stargate by force, through the new atomic and nuclear technologies that exist. Now, there are two natural radiation belts around the Earth, discovered in 1958 by James Van Allen. The natural belts are 64,000 miles deep. The astronauts would have to traverse them for 4 hours. The crafts were extremely thin and not at all protected from radiation of any kind, nor were there linen suits. The radiation in these belts increases when there's solar activity, such as the 11-year solar flare activity. Now, this activity was especially prominent during the Apollo 11 flights in 1967 to 69. Its strongest ever recorded activity was 1972, when the Apollo 13 was launched. So here we have not only it known by scientists that there's tremendous radiation up there, we have these belts that are thousands, literally thousands of miles deep, which would take days to traverse. And then we have to factor in the fact that the hull of the spacecraft, the Apollo, is far too thin to keep out that radiation, as are the spacesuits. And we even then find that the radiation was at its strongest when the Apollo 11 mission was meant to have taken place. The US project A119 in the 1950s was a project to nuke the moon. As we said, the moon is the keystone, the lodestone that in some way is the active principle in the generation of the Stargate. The moon has some important relevance here as a kind of a lodestone in the Stargate. Well, the Rand Corporation and Kellogg wanted to nuke the moon in 1956. NASA in 57 had Project Red Sox, which was dedicated to the research of how to do that. Edward Teller, the father of the hydrogen bomb, was very eager to have the moon nuked, to put nuclear explosions on the moon. And the Soviets in 1950 had Project E4. In 1962, another radiation belt was artificially created by the US military when they detonated a megaton nuclear bomb 248 miles above the Earth in order to create a corridor through the natural belts. The radiation from this detonation created a third belt with 100 times the radiation of the other belts. Sir Bernard Lovell said that the detonation was cataclysmic. So these villagers in Arkansas are seeing flashes in the sky. Flashes in the sky, we've got nuclear explosions in the megatons going off up there, destroying our ionosphere. This desperate attempt, we might even question, why would you want to create a passageway through the ionosphere in this particular kind of means, unless there was another agenda that we're not being told? Believe it or not, there was even an attempt, even there's a technology research to find a way to move the planet Earth to a new location of our solar system. They claim they need to do this to offset the worst effects of global warming. Yeah, right. Now, I want to be specific here. This was an idea to literally move the planet Earth from its original orbit, which I believe is tied into the idea that they're thinking if you can do that, that might also break the chain, break the Stargate, to literally move the planet Earth itself. One of the most important methodologies, and possibly one that might in the future be even successful, is microwave technology, such as HAARP, which was originally created or researched in Alaska, which is powerful microwave technology. In my book, I actually go into the fact that it is the superheating of the atmosphere, the superheating of the ionosphere, and it is these nuclear detonations that is responsible for the ozone hole. And it's not CFCs and the McDonald's cartons. CFCs are a contributing factor to problems in the ozone, but CFC molecule is 3 times heavier than air. It doesn't rise, it sinks. So if CFCs got up there, it's because of nuclear detonations on the Earth. It's to do with the upswing from rockets when they're taking off and going up there. They drag the dust up there and take the CFCs there. And CFCs have been an agricultural problem for many years. But the real contributing factor to the hole in the ozone layer, now nicely covered up, is in fact the superheating of the ionosphere by microwave technology and detonations up there. Now, HAARP is very important in this scenario because it has been specifically designed to try and break through the Stargate. It's pretty much an analogy can be used of a burglar. Any type of burglar who's trying to penetrate through a security fence, the idea is to put a dummy wire situation. You connect a dummy wire here and a dummy wire here to break the circuit, and then you can cut the main fence and leave yourself a portal to go through. Now, of course, you don't go up to the ionosphere with a pair of pliers or a hacksaw, but what you can do is try to break the Stargate and open a portal by way of lasers and microwave technology. Microwave technology is created in Alaska, it's all tested, then they mount it onto satellites, which help to create a beam either on the moon or out into outer space. And by beaming these high-frequency microwave beams onto the Stargate, they're hoping to break through. And as yet, they have not been successful. Now, all its combined transmitters send 3.6 million watts of radio frequency output. Jerry Smith, in his book HAARP, The Ultimate Weapon of the Conspiracy, writes, HAARP has a unique feature, a patented ability to focus these transmissions into a single point high in the sky. This magnifies an output of 1,000 times, giving HAARP an effective radiated power in excess of 3.6 billion watts. So HAARP is normally, when it's on Earth, about 3.6 million watts, which is, by the way, almost 1 million times more powerful than the documents at its inception say it needed to be. So it's millions of times. Nick Bajik will admit this, the man who uncovered the HAARP agenda in his book, Angels Don't Play This HAARP, and so on. He also is confounded by this, because not knowing what the real use of HAARP is and thinking it's just a military device, cannot explain how it is 1 million times more powerful than it ever could possibly need to be for military purposes. Well, it's very easy to explain. There's no mystery once you understand what the agenda is, the real agenda. But as Smith is saying here, HAARP can be focused so that it even has so much more power than that. 3.6 billion watts is actually its full potential. He says, the signal will be sent to the top of our atmosphere where it is intended to heat a portion of the sky. This type of transmitter is called an ionospheric heater. There are several ionospheric heaters in use around the world today. HAARP, however, will be many times more powerful than all of them combined. Now, Richard Allen Miller and Iona Miller, in the Nexus magazine, volume 10, in their interview say, researcher Guy Kramer has suggested that HAARP array may be used to bounce deadly signals off the ionosphere and moon to target sites on Earth and with major explosions, virtually eliminating the need for tactical nuclear weapons. And there's no denying that, yes, the lower level people involved in this, the lower level military people who are not privy to the main agenda, that's what the beauty of a pyramid is, are working on it happily because they think, yes, this is a perfect weapon, and oh, we won't need SDI, and we won't need all of these other clunking military apparatus. Let's just have HAARP, and we can incinerate people all over the planet. It's the super weapon. How wonderful. It'll be just like a video game. Right, they think that. But what's the real agenda, the real power? The 3 billion watt signal originating in Alaska can be caroomed off the moon to reach virtually everywhere on the planet, on the surface or underground with heat radiation. Since it does not leave contamination, it can even terminate targets covertly. But guess what? HAARP is funded by Arco Corporation, which is owned by, oh, guess who? The British Queen Elizabeth. Arco connotes the word archon, which means fallen angel. That's right. We have to look at the subliminal way that we're being told things. It's very important to open your symbolic literacy. So Atlantic Richfield Corporation Company, etc., that's its official meaning, but there's another meaning beside that. Anyone who's done their homework, who knows the ancient magical languages of the ancient world, knows and recognizes the word arco. It comes from the word archon, which means the fallen angels, or the intelligence of the fallen angels. Just like we looked at earlier, the cosmocrates, those who are the angelic beings who overlook the cities and the rituals of the world. HAARP is also used for several other reasons. One of the most important is to trap incoming UFOs. It's very important to note this, that many of the UFOs that visit our planet, you can come through the semi-permeable membrane of the Stargate. So the elites on this planet realize, listen, we're having problems for hundreds and hundreds of years trying to vacate the planet. What would happen if we could create a web-like frequency, microwave frequency, that could in fact trap and down other UFOs incoming? Then, if we were able to down them successfully, we'd be able to loot those ships and find out how they work, and perhaps even use those very ships, once we know how they work, to get out of here. That's another scenario. If I was them, I'd probably be thinking that as well. And that's what Roswell and a lot of the other crashes are all about. Because it's a little bit too much of a stretch of the imagination, is it not? To think that spaceships that can cross hyperspace, cross the event horizons of suns, fly throughout the universe, then just happen to suddenly career and caroom out of control as soon as they enter into our atmosphere. And Richard Hoagland and others have even got footage showing that there are Earth agencies shooting some set of rays to incoming craft. This has actually been videotaped by NASA. The idea is to trap one of these like a fly in the middle of the air and try to bring it down. And in most cases it doesn't work. But there has been cases in which it has worked. And these ships have been downed. Military have been on the spot in a few minutes. And these entities and beings that are in these ships have been taken away to Area 51 and to other locations to be debriefed. And the ships, of course, their technology will be studied thoroughly in order to assist humans to vacate the planet. But one of the other most important aspects of HARP was to create the possibility for mass mind control. With HARP and these radio frequencies and radiotronic weaponry mounted on the satellites, mind control on a mass scale becomes much more easy. And the term that is technically used for that type of behavior control or mind control is entrainment. And in Jerry Smith's book, which is an excellent book, you can read about the actual power of HARP in that matter. And Jerry Smith is getting his information from one of the leading lights in this kind of study, Jim Keith. He was, of course, assassinated. The great scholar Jim Keith, in his book Mass Control, is one of the leading researchers on the subject of mind control. Goes into the history of Dr. Jose Delgado that we mentioned earlier, a fine scholar in this particular field. And he talks about entrainment. Now, fitting into our four scenarios, of course, if scenario 2 was to take place, which means that the Nephilim, the progeny, realize they're not going anywhere. They cannot leave here, so they're stuck with it. They've got all the technology, but they ain't going anywhere. Then they start to rule and reign openly. There's no more covert action, there's no more secret societies, no more hidden government. They come out into the open, and they need to make, because their numbers are few, they need to make use of this kind of technology to control everyone. In Northern Ireland, it's a simple gun to the head situation, which is the most primitive way you can do it, to control the whole of the population there. But there's different kinds of weaponry for a country of this size or for the world in general. Now, Richard Allen Miller and Iona Miller in their Nexus magazine interview say, for epochs, Schumann resonances have provided the orchestrating pulse for life on this planet, our planetary heartbeat, which sets the tempo for health and well-being. But now the very heart of the planet is in jeopardy, according to Framework Convention on Climate Change. ELF, that's extra low frequencies, from Schumann resonance are intimately linked with those of brain waves. Natural or artificially induced changes in the Schumann resonance could affect the subtle and perhaps gross brain wave generation. Liquid crystals, which are DNA, brain ventricles, and cellular structures, in the human body may operate as antenna for detecting and decoding such global and local ELF signals. So let's be in no doubt from what these researchers are saying, our body is an electromagnetic antenna. Should there be any fluctuation not only in the normal Earth energies, but should those be influenced or precipitated by external interference, the human body will respond dramatically and almost instantly. There is an harmonic relationship between the Earth and our mind-body. Earth's low-frequency isoelectric field, the magnetic field of the Earth, and the electrostatic field that emerges from our bodies are closely interwoven. Our internal rhythms interact with external rhythms, affecting our balance, our REM patterns, and mental focus. Schumann resonance waves probably help regulate our body's internal clock, affecting sleep and dream patterns, arousal patterns, and hormonal secretion. Environmental rhythm, the fundamental driving system for all life on our small blue planet, is jeopardized by human manipulation of the ionosphere, such as HARP. 90 Russian deputies signed an appeal against the HARP program, charging that the experiments would create weapons capable of breaking radio communication lines and equipment installed on spaceships and rockets, could provoke serious accidents in electricity networks and in oil and gas pipelines, and have a negative impact on the mental health of people populating entire regions. Some researchers are speculating that the entrainment process has already happened or is being dabbled in, and that's why there's a rising levels of depression and delinquency in our world that cannot be normally explained in any other way. Jim Keith was certainly a big believer that this entrainment process has already begun in certain regions of the world. Now in the book of Enoch, we read, "And when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. And they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, and to devour one another's flesh. Then the earth laid accusation against the lawless ones." And this whole campaign against nature is central stage in this whole scenario. From the earliest times, certainly from the post-Diluvian epochs that we were looking at, right down to the present day. The whole extent of this crime against the planet, we can read here. Ecologists fear that we are losing between 50 and 150 species each day, a rate thousands of times higher than the evolutionary background extinction rate of about one species a year. Some estimate that we have lost perhaps 600,000 species since the biotic holocaust began around 1950. If present trends continue, half of all the species on Earth would be extinct in the next 50 years. Overhunting, pollution, and climate change are factors in this sixth mass extinction event. But by far the greatest cause is habitat loss. The lost ecological services would be devastating. It may take 5 million to 10 million years for biological diversity to recover. Half of the Earth's original forest cover is gone, and an additional 30% is degraded and fragmented. Only 20% of the original forest on Earth remains today as large, relatively undisturbed frontier forests. And half of this frontier forest is threatened by human activity, mostly by logging. Another 100,000 square miles of forest is lost each year, mostly in the tropics, and only a very small amount of this forest loss is offset by regrowth. Since 1960, about 30% of the Earth's tropical forests have disappeared, and with them, thousands of species. Between 50% and 90% of the terrestrial species inhabit and depend upon the forests, and more than half of the threatened vertebrate species on Earth are forest animals. Now, the United Nations says that $40 billion a year, about what consumers spend on cosmetics, would provide everyone on Earth with clean water, sanitation, health care, adequate nutrition, and education. The Secretary General of the 1992 Earth Summit cautioned, "No place on the planet can remain an island of affluence in a sea of misery. We're either going to save the world, the whole world, or no one will be saved." But it's an old story, and it's been foreseen by the prophets of old, perhaps some of the Lemurian bloodline, who are the bringers of culture, the sensitive ones, the ones with the human DNA, who have sensed these travesties even before they've begun. From Pastor Bartholomeus, in 1638, we read a prophecy. He says, "A great change will come to pass, such as no mortal man will have expected. Heaven and hell will confront each other in this struggle. Old states will perish, and light and darkness will be pitted against each other with swords. But it will be swords of a different fashion. With these swords, it will be possible to cut up the skies and to split the earth. A great lament will come over all mankind, and only a small batch will survive the tempest, the pestilence, and the horror." In Isaiah 24, "Broken down is the city of chaos. Every home is shut up, so that none can enter. In the streets there is an outcry. All joy has reached its eventide. The mirth of the world is gone. Desolation is left to the city, and its gates are battered to ruins." Was Isaiah talking about his own times or something to come? It would be a good idea to understand why it is that the space shuttle, not only the space shuttle, but many other programs have the names that they do. The space shuttle Atlantis, on its way out into the nether. all the funding and research that goes into this type of technology. It has a purpose. Ronald Reagan himself said, if suddenly there was a threat to this world from some other species or from some other planet, we'd forget all the little local differences that we have between our two countries, and we would find out once and for all that we really are all human beings on this earth. This was Ronald Reagan's speech in a full session of the United Nations on September 21st, 1987. He's literally telling us there are only a handful of people who know the truth about this, that an alien force is already present and has been present on the earth. And we are being told, we have been warned. Many movies, many books, many researchers, so we have warnings not only from the traditional non-fiction, from hardcore scientists, specialists and researchers, but we have it in fiction, reaching the masses, reaching the mass populace of the world. They're seeing it in visual images before their eyes. Here from the show and the film Stargate, the concept is a traveler from distant stars escaped from a dying world looking for a way to extend his own life. His body, decaying and weak, he could not prevent his own demise. Apparently, his whole species was becoming extinct. So he traveled, searched the galaxies looking for a way to cheat death. He came to a world rich with life, where he encountered a primitive race, humans, a species which, with all his powers and knowledge, he could maintain indefinitely. He realized within a human body he had the chance for a new life. He found a young boy. So Ra took him and possessed his body like some kind of a parasite looking for a host. And inhabiting this human form, he appointed himself ruler. There was a rebellion on earth. Fearful, Ra outlawed reading and writing. He did not want people to remember the truth. And what are we being told in movies like this? In Highlander, we read this remarkable statement. We hear the voice of Sean Connery narrate the following at the very inception of the film. From the dawn of time we came, moving silently down through the centuries, living many secret lives. No one has ever known we were among you until now.